By now, you've heard that last week, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Michael Chauvin was found guilty of all 3 charges against him. Was justice actually served, or despite the actual evidence in favor or against Mr. Chauvin, did the grand jury cave to the mob rule of BLM, Antifa, Marxist agitators, and Congresswoman Maxine Waters' incitement of violence if they had reached the opposite verdict? Today we'll examine this, the role of the media, the real agenda going on, and what you can do to stop it in this episode of Analysis Behind the News, where we provide the perspective that you can use to restore American liberty and independence. A week ago, last Tuesday, Judge Peter Cahill read aloud that the jury found Chauvin guilty of all 3 counts: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. This ruling came days after Democrat Congresswoman or Representative Maxine Waters of California attended a protest in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, and told a reporter, quote, "We've got to stay in the streets, and we've got to demand justice. We're looking for a guilty verdict. We're looking for a guilty verdict. And I hope we're going to get a verdict that says guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away. We've got to stay in the streets, and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational." In other words, rule our way or else. Sounds like American justice, right? Then there was President Joe Biden, who chimed in before the verdict was announced, telling reporters from the Oval Office that he was, quote, praying the verdict is the right verdict, which is, I think, it's overwhelming in my view. As attorney Bradley P. Moss tweeted, "No sitting president should be publicly weighing in on how a jury should rule in a pending criminal matter. No president, liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican. Just no." Despite Waters and Biden's remarks weighing in on and possibly influencing the verdict, Judge Cahill refused to declare a mistrial based on the possible jury tampering by such remarks. However, Judge Cahill did say that Waters' comments, quote, may have given Chauvin something on appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned. In the meantime, however, Chauvin remains in custody awaiting sentencing. But what about the verdict itself? Was it based on an objective weighing in on the evidence? The New American's R. Court Kirkwood reported, "The jury reached that verdict despite clear and convincing evidence that Floyd overdosed on fentanyl and other drugs and suffered serious cardiovascular problems. The county coroner told a prosecutor that Floyd had taken a fatal dose of fentanyl, an opiate at least 50 times more powerful than morphine. The autopsy found that Chauvin, who had pinned Floyd to the ground because he resisted arrest, inflicted no life-threatening injuries. The autopsy also found that Floyd suffered severe coronary artery disease, high blood pressure, and hypertensive heart disease." Cahill did not permit Chauvin's attorney to present evidence of Floyd's drug addiction and violent criminal past. Now, were any of these facts reported and repeated in the fake news so-called mainstream media's 24-hour coverage of the trial? Instead, the media has fed into the Marxist narrative that all cops are bad and that our nation is plagued with systemic racism, despite the fact that the left now controls and runs the Minneapolis City Council, Mayor's Office, the Minnesota House of Representatives, Governor's Office of Minnesota, U.S. Congress, the presidency, the national news media, entertainment industry, big tech, social media, and large Fortune 500 companies. However, as we in the John Birch Society have repeatedly stated for decades, we are not facing a racial problem. Our enemy is not a skin color, black or white. Our enemy is an ideology. It's Marxism, communism, and globalism, which are all various shades of collectivism. The real threat behind the violent BLM and Antifa agitators in the streets are their Marxist and collectivist leaders and funders. They are the ones using the veneer of race to divide the people in order to advance their communist and collectivist agenda of more and more greater government control over not just local police, but over every aspect of our lives. When was the last time that CNN or ABC reported on the goodness of America, or how a police officer, regardless of his or her race, helped save or rescue an individual that is black, white, or any other race? If certain incidents don't align with their narrative and the agenda the media wants to push, then it doesn't get reported. The real news lies in what isn't said or reported. In the wake of George Floyd's death and police shootings throughout the country, since then, the focus is always shifted to the supposed need for passing national police reform, namely the Democrats' George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021, currently in Congress, H.R. 1280, which passed in the U.S. House of Representatives on March 3, 2021 by a vote of 220 to 212, and is currently pending in the Senate. The bill seeks to prohibit local law enforcement from practicing what it describes as racial, religious, and discriminatory profiling, and would mandate all local police officers to be indoctrinated in sensitivity training about the adverse effects of such profiling. The bill also bars police officers from performing certain restraining tactics, such as chokeholds. And the bill would achieve these and other leftist-desired reforms by tearing down the barriers of federalism established in our nation's Constitution. According to a fact sheet about the bill put together by the Democrat-controlled House Judiciary Committee, the Justice, or the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would 1. Establish a national standard for the operation of police departments. 2. Mandate data collection on police encounters. 3. Reprogram existing funds to invest in transformative community-based policing programs. And 4. Streamline federal law to prosecute excessive force and establish independent prosecutors for police investigations. When you extend the lines to each of these actions, this bill inevitably puts its own chokehold on our local police departments. If America turns a blind eye to what is actually happening, our local police will eventually cease to exist and a national police will fill the void. Establishing a national standard to govern how local police departments operate is actually a significant step toward nationalizing police, which is the goal of the deep state to move us more in the direction of a total national police state. The bill's main sponsor is Democrat Congresswoman Karen Bass of California. She's no stranger to the communist left. In a 2008 interview with the authors of the book Black Los Angeles, American Dreams and Racial Realities, Bass boasted how from an early age she was surrounded and influenced by members of the Communist Party USA. She recalled, quote, "It, the white left, played a huge role for me in Hamilton High School. For instance, lots of the Jewish parents were activists. Some of them were in the Communist Party. So I grew up with a lot of red diaper babies, and there were some African American parents who were in the Communist Party. There were teachers who were in the Communist Party. So white radicals were very influential, and at the same time, you have the Panthers and the whole black movement." Bass has been in communist and socialist circles throughout her whole life. For example, she was a member of both the Black Panther Party and the pro-Castro Cuban Communist Party-backed Venceremos Brigade, and she's also worked closely with the Democratic Socialists of America. As for her affiliation with the Venceremos Brigade, it's worth noting that since that subversive group was founded way back in 1969, they've served as a front organization for Communist Cuba's intelligence agency, the DGI, to recruit Americans. The DGI is Cuba's version of the Soviet KGB. On April 17, 1993, Bass was also one of several invited speakers at the West Coast Socialist Scholars Conference that was held at the University of California in Los Angeles. Bass was also a protege of the late O'Neil Cannon, a longtime and leading member of the Communist Party USA's National Central Committee. In fact, on January 30th of 2017, on the floor of the House of Representatives, Bass honored Cannon as her, quote, friend and mentor. All of this said, it's no surprise that Bass holds a dismal cumulative score of 28% in the New Americans Freedom Index, which rates members of Congress on their fidelity to the Constitution based on how they voted. Nevertheless, Bass is considered a rising star in the Democratic Party, and her radical George Floyd Justice and Policing bill has the backing of the White House. Shortly after the announcement of Chauvin's guilty verdict, Vice President Kamala Harris addressed the nation from the White House. In her remarks, she urged the U.S. Senate to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Here's what she said.
Good evening. First, I want to thank the jury for their service, and I want to thank Mr. Floyd's family for your steadfastness. Today, we feel a sigh of relief. Still, it cannot take away the pain. A measure of justice isn't the same as equal justice. This verdict brings us a step closer, and the fact is, we still have work to do. We still must reform the system. Last summer, together with Senator Cory Booker and Representative Karen Bass, I introduced the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This bill would hold law enforcement accountable and help build trust between law enforcement and our communities. This bill is part of George Floyd's legacy. The President and I will continue to urge the Senate to pass this legislation, not as a panacea for every problem, but as a start. This work is long overdue. America has a long history of systemic racism.
Following her brief remarks, President Biden delivered a longer speech in which he also pledged his support for the national police reform legislation, saying,
"We also need Congress to act. George Floyd was murdered almost a year ago. There's meaningful police reform legislation in his name. You just heard the Vice President speak of it. She helped write it. Legislation to tackle systemic misconduct in police departments, to restore trust between law enforcement and the people they're entrusted to serve and protect. But it shouldn't take a whole year to get this done." In my conversations with the Floyd family, I spoke with them again today, I assure them we're going to continue to fight for the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act so I can sign it into law as quickly as possible.
In other words, a guilty verdict for former police officer Chauvin isn't enough. All active duty local and state police and sheriffs must also pay their fair share of social justice through increased federal controls over local police and law enforcement. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is the most far-reaching and radical bill of its kind to go after local police. If the U.S. Senate passes it and Biden signs it into law, as he pledged, it would handcuff local police from effectively serving and protecting their communities. Never mind how bad this legislation is, it's completely unconstitutional. The 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution plainly states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Federal control or guidelines over local police is not one of the enumerated powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Instead, any and all police reforms for local law enforcement falls directly under the purview of their respective local and state governments. Local police departments and sheriff's offices serve the people in their local municipalities or counties. They are not employees or officers of the federal government. We at the John Birch Society encourage you to support your local police and keep them independent from the federal government, Congress, and the President by using our Stop Federal Police Reform Bill H.R. 1280 legislative alert on jbs.org to contact and urge your U.S. senators to oppose and defeat this unconstitutional and radical federal power grab over your local police departments and sheriff's offices. This bill is a major step towards nationalizing local police into a federal police force. Historically, national police are the hallmark of dictatorships and oppressive regimes around the world. The autonomy of our local police is paramount to the survival of our country as a free and federalist republic. We should never capitulate to mob rule and the demands of collectivist extremists. Until next week, stay informed, stay active, and stay free.